From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Gregg Ibendahl is back, this time to discuss his just-released early projections on net farm income in Kansas here in 2021. He'll talk about the variables he used to come up with this income forecast. Then a look at the first of a 3-year project here at K-State aimed at developing wheat and sorghum-based foods for human consumption. And a student dining center here at the university is serving as the proving ground for these new products. Discussing the project, K-State's Kelly Getty, Christy Vavra, and Sarah Sexton-Bowser, and from the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Kerry Wefald. And, of course, K-State's Charlie Lee will be in for the weekly wildlife management segment. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
This is Agriculture Today, our Tuesday edition. Thanks for being along with us. What is the outlook on farm income in Kansas as we forge into 2021? We have an early look at that right now via a new report put together by our guest. Gregg Ibendahl is with us, farm management economist, K-State Research and Extension. This is a preliminary projection on 2021 farm income, tying back in what 2020's numbers may end up to be when those are all said and done. So, Gregg, you utilized that fine resource, the Kansas Farm Management Association, and its data for this analysis, correct?
Yeah, so basically, we don't have 2020 data yet from the KFMA folks to get an accurate number for that totally yet, but we do have a lot of the numbers that go into that, so we know what yields have been, we know what prices have been, we know what a lot of the government payments numbers are. So 2020 is really not that much of a stretch for what's going to happen this year, and it was nice to be able to base my 2020 and 21 estimate really off what happened with our 2019 farms. When we get to 2021, though, that's a little bigger stretch. So, we're trying to make projections for net farm income for a lot of crops that are still sitting in your shed in a bunch of seed bags. So, we assume a lot of things that's going to happen between now and the end of the year. And then number one, the biggest assumption is we probably assume normal yields going into 2021. And, in Kansas, that may or may not happen.
As we look back to 2020 as the baseline from which you can project income in 2021 then, things changed as the year went on in 2020, lending to actually more optimism on that year's numbers, right, Gregg?
Yeah, so in early 2020, when we had the whole COVID thing come through, there was a lot of interest. Well, what's this going to do to net farm income? So I made an attempt to do that back in May of this past year, and based on what prices were doing and everything, it looked like 2020 was going to be a disaster for farmers. I think I still had us kind of sketching out maybe just a little bit of a profit, but it was way, way down, like 80 or 90% over what it was the year before. So it looked really, really bad at that point in time.
And then it changed considerably.
Yes. Well, several things, I guess, went into that. Number one would be, prices for grain started to improve dramatically once we hit about midsummer or so. And then there was also several rounds of COVID relief funds, the CFAP payments, and that helped quite a bit too. So between the higher CFAP payments and the improved grain prices, 2020 actually is going to turn out to have higher net farm income than what we had in 2019, which was a total shock to me that would ever happen back in last May.
Right. As you went about this analysis of 2021's possible income, you utilized, over 500 records from Kansas Farm Management Association farms?
Yeah, so this initial analysis, basically I just looked at grain farm because it's a little more detail some of those CPAP payments for livestock producers, but there's still some of that even in the grain farm. So I basically took our 588 grain farms in the KFMA program, and one thing I did do different in this analysis was I made sure that I had 3 years worth of data for those farms. That kind of limited my number to some degree, but it helped me get a kind of a historical background for farms so I could do something with their historical yields and such. that may predict, I think, going into 2020 a little bit easier for me to do with that extra years of background information.
It'd be worthwhile to talk about the variables that go into this analysis one by one and what your expectations are for these, starting with yields in 2021. What are you presuming here or figuring here, Gregg?
Well, so with all these numbers here, I'm really taking everything back to the farm level. So even though like for yields, I may only have an estimation of what the state is. Basically, I project that backwards, going back from the state level back to the crop reporting district, back to the county and down to the farm. So going for the yields, I think we're just really kind of talking about the idea, at least for now, that we're kind of assuming normal yields. It's been a certainly a dry winter and such dry fall going into this year. So that's certainly no guarantee. But I think this La Nina thing could be about over from what I've read anyway. So I'm still hopeful that we're going to have normal yields going into 2021 planting season. And
you mentioned the price rebound in 2020. As you look at the price variable, you're thinking that what we see now in these markets will bear up fairly well for the balance of the year? What?
So we do have, that's the one thing where I don't have to guess a whole lot. So there are future prices, going out for the next couple of years. So we can use that as a basis, looking at kind of the relationship between the future prices and the price we get at the state level. So I use those historical bases and actually then project a price level at the farm level. So assuming that the traders know what they're doing as far as predicting prices, I think we can take that as a good estimate for what prices in Kansas are going to be.
Right. Have you been able to get a notion on crop production expenses as they would go into this income analysis then?
Yeah, so I had to, that was one of the reasons why I want to go down to the farm level for my analysis, because it makes it easier for me to go back and analyze what happens when we do have a shift in acreage, because then I can make an appropriate adjustment then, and it works its way back up to a state level forecast. So, there's some ideas we already have what's going to happen with. I've already been looking at fuel prices. I have an early Ag Manager publication about that. Mm-hmm. And that's going to tie into it. Also, a related publication I'm going to have coming out in about another week or so about fertilizer prices. So I really see a lot of our expense items going up a lot in this coming year, especially I think fuel is going to go up. I think we probably have seen the low point in both gas and diesel and probably like LP natural gas prices. And I think fertilizer prices are going to go up from now and until probably at least for the next 9 months or so. So fertilizer is going to be a big expense. Now, the one good thing is that I think farmers probably have purchased a lot of their fuel and fertilizer for this coming year before things started going up. At least I hope that's the case. I hope not. Someone hasn't waited till the last minute to buy fertilizer and fuel for planting season. So the big increase we're going to see this year in 2021 for a lot of those expenses, they're not going to see those right away at the farm level. I think maybe some of those will maybe hold off for the coming year. But we had the same thing happen going into 2020, that we saw a big drop in expenses then too. But farmers, again, had already prepaid for a lot of things. So they didn't quite realize the big drop in fuel and fertilizer that occurred during 2020. But again, that kind of carries over into what's happening now in this coming year.
And one more set of variables we'll mention, although there's more in your write-up on this, government payments. And that would include the farm bill payments, ad hoc payments, and things that came along in 2020 that normally aren't part of the picture.
Yeah, so we've had those now quite a few years in a row, and starting really, even if you go back to like 2018, we had the market facilitation payments. Mm-hmm. If you look at my write-up for this, I'm calling those ad hoc payments. Those were actually a pretty significant share of net farm income, both in 2018 and 2019. I think in 2018 that the ad hoc MFP payments turned out to be about $46,000 per farm. In 2019, they were about $71,000. So that was a big chunk of money that went toward net farm income in those 2 years. Those went away in 2020 and have been replaced with these two CFAP payments. Now, again, there's a potential third one that's kind of being held up. We don't know if that's going to happen or not. But for 2020, at least, I'm projecting that those two payments for grain producers were about $35,000. And then for livestock producers in 2020, those were about $18,000 to $19,000.
But for 21, the presumption then is that those will be less prominent than they were in 2020?
Well, yeah, that's the trouble with these ad hoc payments, because you don't know for sure what's going to happen with those. So right now I don't have anything built in for those going forward. So I have kind of had those zeroed out. And the same thing with the regular government payments. Those potentially are going to be much lower too. I think again, we have most of the acres that'll show up in the 2021 payments. We're probably in TLC acres. And I think there might be a chance for a wheat payment, but the other crops probably not. So I would certainly expect to see a drop-off in government payments in 2021 as well.
Well, then funnel it all down to your outlook on net farm income in 2021. What does your number tell you there, Greg?
Well, so in 2020, I'm looking at basically about a 7% increase. Now, this is, again, just looking at my 588 grain farms that I'm looking at. So we had a net farm income in 2019 of 138. I expect 2020's income to be higher, 7% higher at about 137 or so. And then I really think, even though the fact we're going to have lower government payments and there's no guarantee of any kind of special ad hoc payments, I think those higher grain prices are going to give us a nice boost to overall net farm income in 2021, potentially 30 or 35% higher, which would take us up to about the $185,000 level for 2021. Again, assuming normal yields and that those future prices translate back down to the farm level.
I have to ask you this, though, Greg. Even after your write-up went online, the USDA posted its early outlook on 2021 farm income. This across the U.S. as you compare it, which suggested lower net farm income overall, to what you have here, a bump in net farm income, at least in Kansas. What's your thinking on that comparison?
Well, just looking at that report, I did see that too. So I think they actually had a bigger increase in 2020 than what I predicted. And then they actually saw a little bit of a decline in 2021. I'm kind of the opposite. I think we're seeing a smaller increase in 2019. But I still think the overall increase in grain prices are going to outweigh the drop in government payments and those ad hoc payments. So the fact that we are going to end up with higher net farm income. So I am disagreeing with them from that perspective. But again, they're looking at the entire U.S. where I'm looking at Kansas too. So that could be part of it as well.
Keep it in perspective, though. This is offered as a very early outlook.
Yes, as we found out last year. No guarantees at all for this kind of thing, for sure.
As we found out, things can change year 2020.
My May of 2020 forecast made me look like a weatherman because I came out pretty bad looking at that when I wanted to ever close. I'm hoping I'm better than the weatherman when it comes to forecasting net farm income.
Well, there's much more detail to this analysis, and you producers, you ought to get a look at it. It's posted on the agmanager.info website as we speak, entitled a preliminary estimate of 2020 Kansas net farm income and a projection for 2021. It's at agmanager.info. Let's see if the numbers hold up, Greg. If they do, favorable times ahead for our Kansas producers. Many thanks to you.
Yes, thank you.
Gregg Ibendahl, farm management economist, K-State Research and Extension, on this opening part of Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Passing along on this segment the story of a project that's being worked upon by Kansas State University in cooperation with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and it's exploring new possibilities in grain, sorghum, and wheat product development for human consumption. It has a lot of angles to it, which we want to explore today. We have no less than 4 folks with us to talk this over. From the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Marketing Director Kerry Wefald. From K-State, the Managing Director of the Center for Sorghum Improvement, Sarah Sexton-Bowser. Also, a K-State food scientist, Kelly Getty, has joined us, along with one of her students, Christy Vavra. And we'll let Kerry lead this off. Kerry, this is a project under the banner of Farm Us. What is that exactly?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you, Eric. Within the Department of Agriculture, we're always working to secure ways to promote our agricultural commodities. When you look at the state of Kansas, historically, our sorghum and wheat production ranks in the top. And looking at ag growth opportunities for each of the sorghum and wheat sectors, both sectors have indicated interest in diversifying markets. So the Department of Agriculture worked with USDA Agriculture Marketing Service to secure funds through our federal state marketing improvement program to support the Farm Us grant, which is a farm-to-campus collaborative encouraging, teaching, and mentoring young adults in the food science curriculum to develop concept food items using sorghum and wheat. which are two of our most popular commodities within the state of Kansas. So we are just pleased to partner and have the innovation of the next generation of food scientists working with sorghum and wheat to develop food items that their generation will most likely embrace and purchase in the grocery or out in the restaurant or retail markets.
It's a novel idea, a great idea. Let's bring Sarah in for a little more background as to exactly how this is playing out, this project.
Well, Eric, you're right. It's a novel idea. We have a fantastic individual within K-State Food Service and Dining. Her name is Kelly Whitehair. Early on in my role, she reached out and said, Sarah, I want our students to experience Kansas agriculture products. And she had ideas. She started putting together some grain bowls and other features. And we had these micro wins where she really was able to take and use her creativity and talent and integrate Kansas products into the food offerings. And then we needed to pair that with research and innovation. And so that's what this project has allowed us to do.
It has to start, though, with the product. And we want to bring in our food science side to talk about that. Kelly Getty, when you were approached with this particular challenge, what was the line of thinking as to what can be made out of wheat or grain sorghum for human consumption?
Actually, Kelly Whitehair and I started talking about the categories of grain-based baked item. And so we developed 4 categories, one for the students of the rec center, one for a par-baked bun, and then we looked for child nutrition, and then just kind of something thinking outside of the box. So these were the 4 categories we presented to our students in research and development of food products. And we said, bring back some ideas, and then we as a group will kind of vote on those ideas. And so in the end, there were 13 products in product development phases from, a concept to an actual food item. And from that standpoint, I'm pleased to say already that 9 out of the 13 products were decided to move on for scale up in the Kramer Dining Hall. Those products were anywhere from a tomato basil bun to a gluten-free pancake mix, and we had a vegetable cracker for kids that was developed too. So a lot of great things our students did to develop prototypes to move forward. And we have been really pleased to work with Kelly Whitehair in that regard.
It's interesting you came up with quite an array of different products here, suiting different palates, different preferences. Let's bring one of the students in. Christy Vavra, talk about your role here and how you helped implement the testing of these products.
Yeah, so as a student in research and development, like Dr. Getty was saying, we were presented with different categories, and then with the idea that we're taking wheat or sorghum grain and developing a baked good to go into dining services and to do a market screening that kind of allowed us to look at the current market and figure out what trends were missing, and then develop a product using wheat or sorghum that would target that missing market. So my partner and I, Emily, we developed a gluten-free breakfast waffle sandwich that is using sorghum exclusively, and so it's ideal for gluten-free individuals. And there is a missing part of the gluten-free market right now, that there's lots of waffles and pancake mixes, but there was no on-the-go breakfast item in that area, and so we decided to hit that niche of the market and develop, and it has been a great success. And I am part of the scale-up team this semester as well, so I'm seeing my waffle project go on, and then also helping with the other 8 items that were selected. So I am very excited to see it from a paper concept from all of our students in class to a prototype that has been successful with focus groups and gotten really good feedback, and carry that momentum on into dining services and work on scaling it up to a large quantity.
This is the first year of what will be a 3-year project, and we want to bring Kerry and Sarah back in here as well. What is next then? This has worked well in the dining halls of Kansas State University. What more will be on the plate as it goes into year 2 and 3? Sarah?
Well, in the development of this project, we quickly identified that college students are in a formative stage of determining their own preferences and food experiences. And so making sure that first we showcase and have a chance to showcase Kansas grains and commodities on their menus and in their palates as a part of those formative years. And so with that, that's the next step of scaling up. You hear Christy, who's in the scaled team, as she mentioned. She's going to be taking and making sure that the prototype that was an output of the class in a successful way can also be an output into food service and dining. And then with the partnership of Kelly Whitehair at K-State Food Service and the partnership of Jim Schillings at KU, there's another round of opportunity of then disseminating and doing some showcase, having some student experience that can come from this class and experience and go to KU, share the product and the successful outcomes of those products.
I would say, just to add, the first year has really been focused on baked products with wheat and sorghum. We will repeat again in years 2 and 3 and really look at grain-based entrees. We'll look at snack products that are available on campus. But one of the pieces that I don't want to overlook is as the students are developing ideas for their generation, we also have seasoned industry folks in our consortium providing feedback on maybe recipe development, utilization of ingredients, or marketing. And those folks come from a variety. We have our New Life Market in the western part of the state. We have Ingrain here in Manhattan. We also work with Kansas Wheat. We've got state leaders with Dr. Schilling and Dr. Whitehair with KU and K-State Food Service. And then we have our academia team. So there is a consortium that's providing feedback because as the young people present their ideas and their prototype, there's a lot of ownership and pride in what they've created. And then having the industry provide feedback on how that project might fit into today's food network, because we realize these students in food science curriculum here at K-State will be the next leaders in developing food recipes and items within our own state, but also within the country. And we want them to think back to utilizing sorghum and wheat products as they develop new recipes for the companies that they're working for.
And before we finish up, let's bring our food scientists back in. What's the next inspiration for year 2 or year 3? Kelly?
Sure. So the inspiration, as we said, we've broken it down into grain-based entrees. So again, anything from using those grains to make a different type of patty using wheat and sorghum, or to do something like a pop sorghum a snack. Those are just some foods around grain-based items.
Well, the best of luck to all of you in furthering this work in years 2 and 3. If we might, we'll have you back in a year or so for an update on what's happened in the next phase. Thanks for going over this, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Marketing Director Kerry Wefald. Also from the Center for Sorghum Improvement at K-State, Sarah Sexton-Bowser. Kelly Getty with us as well, food scientist at K-State, and one of her students in the food science and industry major, Christy Vavra. Again, they were deeply involved in this project, developing foods for human consumption made of wheat and or grain sorghum, and tested out their viability at food service outlets here at Kansas State University this past year with resoundingly good results. We'll be back with more. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and now on to today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. U.S. agricultural exports totaled $15.9 billion in the month of December, according to the USDA, setting a new record for the month and marking the first time that the value of U.S. ag exports had topped $15 billion for 3 months in a row. The prior monthly record was $15.8 billion. That was set in December of 2013. The December total up from $15.5 billion in November. Imports of agricultural products totaling $11.6 billion, up from $11.3 billion in November. That left a trade surplus of $4.2 billion for the month. The USDA forecasts U.S. agricultural exports at $152 billion for fiscal year 2021. That against imports of $137 billion, that would make for a surplus of $15 billion worth. 3 months into fiscal 21, exports had already totaled over 30% of the forecast for the entire fiscal year. The highest totals for U.S. agricultural exports typically come in the first quarter of a fiscal year. The period for the largest imports still lies ahead in the March to June timeframe. Now, after starting fiscal year 2020 with strong surpluses for the first 3 months, the trade data showed monthly deficits in 6 of the next 7 months. The final result for fiscal 2020 saw exports at $135.8 billion against imports of $133.2 billion for a trade surplus of $2.6 billion. U.S. hog producers are facing another health challenge to their herds in the form of a familiar, a slightly different foe. The most recent strain of the porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome virus isn't anything that producers have not seen before with PRRS, but it is more dramatic and is resulting in higher rates of hog mortality, according to swine veterinarians. The new strain has only been around since last October, and swine researchers don't have much information on how it operates as of yet. One thing they do know is that biosecurity practices will be especially important as producers face this new PRRS strain. It was discussed on a webinar last Thursday addressing the new outbreak, hosted by the Swine Health Information Center and the American Association of Swine Veterinarians. They're suggesting producers review their herd biosecurity plans in the wake of this new PRRS strain. The final rule is now published for a USDA Farm Bill program updating regulations regarding agricultural land and wetland reserve conservation easements. The USDA's Rod Bain has more on that.
So what are some of the updates connected with USDA's Agricultural Conservation Easement Program once the recently published final rule becomes official?
We made some revisions to the ASEP language to allow for those landowners to take credit of environmental markets. We also gave a lot more credence to some of the activity that a lot of our entities who are working with landowners to pursue easements under the ag land easement component of ASEP have the opportunity to be more flexible with how much of the non-federal match comes from the entity themselves versus how much of that non-federal match can come from the landowner. For wetlands, in the interim rule, we included water quality as a priority.
Jimmy Bramblett of the Natural Resources Conservation Service says the final rule updates ASEP as directed by the 2018 Farm Bill, as well as regulations regarding both agricultural land and wetland reserve easements, based on public comments made in the interim final rule published last year. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Time now for this week's edition of Milk Lines. For you dairy producers, here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some of the places we've been in terms of being paid in 2020 for our raw milk and some of the other things that are going on in our component pricing in the past year. And then take a look at how that might transform into some trends for 2021. As I know you are very well aware, as we look at the year 2020 and we look at average milk prices, it was much less than what we received in 2019. So those declines were significant, and probably one of the most painful things about those declines has been what has happened with the producer price differential. So we look at the average for 2020, it was minus $2.17. And when we look at the previous 20 years, we'd never seen a year where that figure was actually a negative number. So that's been one of the things that's probably been the most difficult for us to overcome and to look at when we look at what's going on with the total raw milk market. So what are some other highlights, maybe some positive things that we could pull out of what we see in the averages for 2020? Well, one of the things that I guess I continue to be impressed about our dairy producers is the fact that here in the Central Order we continue to lower the average somatic cell count of the milk that we actually ship. And we've been making significant decreases in that somatic cell count level for the last 20 years. I remember when I first came here to the state, we struggled to sometimes keep our average counts under 400,000. And today, as we look at what has happened during 2020, our herds have consistently been under 200,000. Only during a couple of times during the summer do we actually bounce above that. Most of the time we average somewhere around 175 to 180,000 somatic cell counts. This is tremendous progress that we've made over the last 20 years. It's taken a lot of hard work by our producers, and it's producing a higher quality milk today than we did 20 years ago. So hats off to you as producers for your hard work in that. Some other things that we might note is that toward the end of the year we saw some significant increases in the value of milk protein, and along with that a decrease in the value of milk butter fat or milk fat. So as we think about that and we think about where that leads in 2021, I think we'll continue to see higher value for protein than we do for butter fat. Is that a positive thing for you as a producer? Well, I think you need to think about how you're going to take advantage of that. Components will be an important part of how we increase our paycheck probably as we move into 2021. So paying attention to what we're getting out of our cows in terms of butter fat as well as protein, but maybe more importantly protein, is going to be very important. So I encourage you all as producers to work with your dairy nutritionist to determine how you might be able to increase the amount of total protein production you're seeing from your dairy herd, as well as maintaining or slightly increasing the amount of fat that you also get from your animals. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. Next up for you, this week's wildlife management segment. Of course, former wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension, is aboard for this discussion. Charlie, on new information concerning large bird collisions with airplanes. This is not a nominal issue. As a matter of fact, it's a prominent concern out there.
Yes, it's certainly a big concern. Within the last 30 years, there's been almost 5,000 reported bird and aircraft strikes with large birds. Now, keep in mind that large birds in this case would be birds greater than about 4 pounds. There's certainly a strong correlation between bird mass and the likelihood of aircraft damage due to these bird and aircraft collisions. And most of these collisions, more than 70% of the bird strikes to civilian aircraft, occur less than 150 meters above ground level during takeoff and landings. There's been a lot of integrated management programs to reduce populations of birds that are hazardous to aircraft in the airport environment, and it's essential that we continue those habitat-type programs to reduce habitat quality or whatever else is necessary to reduce bird numbers on the airport themselves. However, you're probably never going to exclude all hazardous birds. They're migratory. Some species flock together. Their flocking behavior would cause the likelihood of damage to be greater. And aircraft have been modified over time to resist some of that damage. The Federal Aviation Administration has developed airworthiness standards for airframes and windshields, and they've done that using single 4-pound birds, and then they've used 8-pound birds for the tail section. They've had standards for turbine engine testing. The size of bird they use in that test there depends upon the type of engine, and those are typically tested with smaller birds. Keep in mind that there is some redundancy on aircraft. Many years ago, it was common for 3 and 4 engine aircraft. Now, it's much more common to have 2 engine aircraft, so less likelihood of recovering successfully with 2 engines if both engines ingest birds and fail. So the objective of this Department of Agriculture Wildlife Services research report was to provide some data on the population numbers, the population trends, and the flocking characteristics of those species that were most likely to cause bird strikes.
Over 30 years' time, that's the extent of the data you say here.
Yeah, so it's 30 years' time with almost 5,000 strikes for the large species, again, those birds that were greater than 4 pounds, and 7,000 with those birds from 2 to 4 pounds. That's almost 12,000 bird strikes in that 30 years. Some of those are certainly catastrophic losses. But what can be done about it, and what are those species that are most likely to be involved? We've talked many times in the past about the percentage of birds, particularly grassland birds and neotropical birds, whose numbers appear to be plummeting. I think the information shows that those smaller species of birds are down about 29%. But that's not the species of birds that are causing these aircraft strikes.
Which are most problematic then?
Well, the Canada goose is the largest, for one, on the large-sized birds, and the medium-size, that means under 4 pounds, would be red-tailed hawk and mallards. And the large size would be Canada geese and vultures, great blue herons, all birds that are fairly common that probably fly fairly slow. Most of them have a flocking behavior. So the likelihood of striking just one bird is not as great as it is for striking multiple birds at that same pass. When we look at the population change on the large birds, that's increased 129%. Now you contrast that with the decline in those grassland birds of 29%, and you can see there's a vast difference in the species of birds that we're talking about. The medium-sized birds, those mallard duck-sized, if you will, have increased 20%. There are many species out there that are increasing. Snow geese is one that we've talked about before, about how their population has skyrocketed so much that they're destroying habitat conditions. Turkey vultures have increased. Cormorants have increased. Pelicans have increased. All of those species have increased in number so much that oftentimes they're considered problematic or nuisance species.
So what can be done with this data in hand now as far as reducing these collision numbers? You mentioned that modifications to aircraft to improve the aircraft's durability against collisions has been tried. Many ideas there. Habitat modifications been tried. Any solutions to this that are practical, Charlie?
Well, they're still looking for solutions. We know that they're trying to develop techniques to improve the visibility of aircraft to birds. There are different lighting schemes that are being looked at. They're looking at different types of radar so that pilots are warned of some of these smaller flocks of birds and can avoid those areas. Yet we still don't have a solution for those scattered birds that are almost impossible to predict their location at any given time. But I think what this data tells us is that perhaps some sort of population management of these birds is certainly necessary to keep the populations down closer to the airport environment in which these bird strikes are most likely to occur. Couple that with trying to improve aircraft safety, making those frames stronger, the windshield stronger, the tail section stronger, as well as the engine to more resist the ingestion or strikes from these large and medium-sized birds.
Well, by the sound of it, it'll remain a challenge that deserves perpetual attention here moving forward. That is the incidence of birds colliding with aircraft. And based on new data on the birds that are most impactful in this way, those larger species. Charlie, thanks for going over this with us today. He's former wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. And so goes our Tuesday edition. As always, we thank you for being along with us and welcome you right back here this same time tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.